This is Flipping Junkie Podcast, Episode 7. Welcome to the Flipping Junkie Podcast. My name is Danny Johnson, former software developer turned house flipper, flipping hundreds of houses. Each week we bring you interviews, strategies, stories, and motivation to help you get started flipping houses and on your way to becoming your own boss and achieving financial freedom. Thanks for spending time with me today. Now let's get to it. Today's guest is none other than Sharon Vornholt from Louisville Gals, realestateblog.com. In today's episode, Sharon and I discuss the ins and outs of wholesaling houses. You're going to learn how to wholesale houses the right way so that you don't have to worry about not being able to find a buyer for your wholesale deals, and exactly how to make sure your end buyer doesn't back out of the deal, leaving you with a tough situation. We also share some awesome escape clauses you can use in your contracts that allow you to gracefully back out of a deal if you ever need to. And thanks again for listening. Enjoy the show. Today I've got a good friend in Louisville, Kentucky named Sharon Vornholt. She's the owner of Innovative Property Solutions in Louisville, Kentucky, and she's been investing in real estate since 1998. She's been a full-time wholesaler since 2008. So Sharon is the creator of Louisville Gals Real Estate blog and the popular podcast Let's Talk Real Estate Investing. She's also a mentor and a coach who loves teaching others how to succeed in this business. Hey Sharon, thanks for being on the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Danny.
Yeah, I know you're busy, so I'm glad that I got you on the call here. And
Well,
go ahead.
I was just gonna say I'm always happy to do it, and it's a pleasure just doing things with you.
Oh, thank you. I wanted to find out more about why you got started real estate investing. You know, a lot of times people will ask, how you got started, but I'd like to hear that too. But could you share with us why you got started in real estate investing and your backstory on how you got started?
Well, growing up, my dad was a contractor, so I had as a child, he used to drag me around to job sites, so I always had this fascination with rehabbing, and he did more commercial spaces, but he was a small business person, so I had that background growing up, and I guess I always knew I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I had jobs certainly, but I was more I more like the creative process of it. So when I started thinking about what business would I go into that would have a house background, honestly, I didn't even think about real estate investing. I didn't know that much about it initially. I owned and operated a home inspection company for a total of 17 years. But about 7 years into that business, in that business, I worked with a lot of real estate agents and I met a lot of realtors. And one of them said, "Hey, why don't you come with me to my RIA group?" And I had no idea what a RIA group was. And she told me, all about it. We had a large RIA group here, even then in Louisville, probably 300 or 400 members. And I went to the meeting, and it was just really opened up a whole new world for me. And I could see how I could make money kind of on my own terms. There were a lot of different ways I could make money. And that was really the reason I got into it. I loved the whole process because I started out rehabbing and as a buy and hold landlord. That was where I actually started out. I kind of got to be an accidental wholesaler along the way. But that was kind of my why, and that's kind of my how I got started.
Wow. So that's a pretty strong group then. 300 to 400 members for Real Estate Investor Association group.
Mm-hmm.
And what year was that about, roughly?
That was 1998. We had a very large group, and then it stayed large really until around the crash of 2008, and then it dropped down to probably about 200.
Mm.
Um, we're in the building phase again. I'm guessing we're up to 350 maybe again. We've got a pretty sizable group here for a city of our population.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So what? So going there and hearing about people's success and the things that they were doing got you interested, what made you decide to start as a rehabber?
Well, it's just like I said, that had always been something that I liked the process of tearing it down and building it back up. Knocking down walls is probably my favorite thing. So it just appealed to me, and I don't know if it was the right place to start or the wrong place to start, but that's where I started. And then my initial plan I had this, how you get a plan, and my plan was to do a rehab and make enough money off of it to put a down payment onto one or two rentals. And that was, I went along with that way for a while. And then in 2000, but I was doing it part time from 1998 to 2008 when I closed the other business. And it all just happened about the same time. I was just really burned out from the other business. And I decided it was the time for me to go into real estate full time. Well, 2008 was the best of, time to be in real estate, but it was also a terrible time at the same
Right.
time. There were there were deals everywhere, but it was absolutely the right time to get out of the home inspection business. So, but I had a house and they had already started sitting on the rehabs had started sitting on the market here for maybe, 6, 8, 9 months at that time. And I just thought, gosh, I just do not want to have this house, get it finished, have to worry about it being vandalized and sitting on the market, the whole deal, carrying the carrying costs and everything. And I thought, well, I wonder if I could wholesale this house. I'd never done any wholesaling ever. So I called up one of my, the people I knew in my area and just said, hey, you want to buy a house? And told them about the house. They said, well, yeah, that's a great deal. And there was really, in that moment, I thought, boy, that was easy. So, but I'd been in the business 10 years by that time. So for the next few years, then I just kept on wholesaling, my intention was always to go back to rehabbing, but I never quite made it back there.
All right, so you've been wholesaling mainly the entire time now since 2008, huh?
Pretty much, yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Then do you recommend wholesaling as a way to get started flipping houses for new investors?
Well, I think it's a way that it works for certain people to start out wholesaling if they have a good grasp of numbers, if they have a mentor. It you can get started with no money, but it's really difficult, as you know, to not have any money. You can drive for dollars and find a house or maybe cold call or something like that. The main problem I see with wholesaling, well, it's the same problem with all strategies when you're first starting out, is that you don't really know what a good deal is. And sometimes you tend to try to make a deal work. So if you're a rehabber and you've misjudged on your figures a little, you can generally still come out. You may not make a lot of money, but you can come out clean in the deal. But if you make a mistake on the buy for a wholesale deal, I mean a sizable mistake, you won't be able to give that property away. The seasoned investors know what you should be paying for those houses. And I think that's one of the big disadvantages of when you're new. You just don't know what you don't know.
Right, and like you said, that goes for also for rehabbing, but you're saying with the rehab, likely you're just likely to less make less than you hoped instead of lose money. But on the wholesale, I guess that depends on if you're looking to assign the contract versus double close. And I guess right now would be a good time to explain what a double close and assignment of contract, what the differences are for people that might not know.
Mhm. Yeah, and I double close everything. I've only assigned just a one or two contracts in all these years. And if you buy a house and you put it under contract, you can simply use a piece of paper that says, I, Sharon Vornholt, give my rights to this assign the rights to associated with this property to Danny Johnson. It's that simple, and then you just collect the difference between what you bought it for and what you're assigning it for. And it's the same way in a double closing. When I do a double closing, I put a house under contract just like you would any other house. But then if I were to sell it to Danny, then I would write up a second contract. Now, I like it because it's clean and because that's kind of the way people do it here. I don't personally like to get in the table and have to the closing table and have the seller know that after we've negotiated our deal that I'm now going to make $10,000 on top of what I offered them. So it costs me about $350 to do a second closing. But in my mind, I just figure that in my deal, and it's worth it to me because go in one room, and the people get confused about it. So we have two contracts. We have the contract where I bought the house, uh, the A to B transaction, A being the seller and the B person is me. I'm the buyer in that transaction. And then when I find a buyer for my deal, that's the B to C transaction, and I am B. So I'm always going to be B. So it's just a matter of the order you sign the paperwork in. When people get confused and they say it's illegal and you can't use your seller's funds to close the deal, well, there's no money dispersed until the first transaction is closed. So it's really no different than if you have an absentee owner. Let's say your seller is an absentee owner and they're out of town and they've signed the paperwork, but you go to the closing and you sign the paperwork with you and your end buyer sign the paperwork, and then they bring in the paperwork from the A to B closing where you purchase the house. And then they collect the money from your end buyer and they take it back, copy all the paperwork, disperse the money. In essence, you are using the funds from the second closing to close the first transaction. Now, the reason they are willing to do that is because you always need to bring certified funds to a closing, as you know. So when I'm there with my end buyer and they have a check, it is a verified, it's verified certified funds. So it's two distinct contracts, two distinct separate sets of paperwork. It's just the order in which the paperwork is signed. You sign the second closing first, and then you signed your purchase second, and then they disperse the money in the proper order. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, just to clarify just a little bit, so some of the finer points, you can use the exact same contract. So, you can take one blank contract, make a copy of it, and on the first contract, which is the A and B transaction, the seller of the house is the one that's selling it, and you're the buyer as the B part of the A B transaction on that contract. And then the exact same blank contract that you have a copy of for the B to C transaction, you are then going to be the seller of the property, and your end buyer, the investor, is going to be the buyer on that B to C transaction, correct?
That's correct. Now, at the bottom of the contract, the only difference is in my contract, and probably everyone's contract should be in the computer. I put down at the bottom where you sign in as buyer and seller. You have to. I will have I will flip flop those things depending on whether I'm the buyer or the seller. You know what I mean? So that piece of it, I'll be the buyer on one case and the seller in another case. But yes, it is the same exact contract. Now there is, if I am buying the house, I'm always going to have some kind of a contingency in there. You could have an inspection contingency, a way for you just in case you've overlooked something and you're an expert, but at looking at rehabs, some people, especially when you're new, they might want to have a contractor look at it or someone. So you can put that kind of a contingency in there. You can also write in something, and this is something that came straight from my closing attorney. This contract is subject to partner approval. Now, what does that mean? Well, it just means that you're going to partner with somebody on the deal and they have to approve the deal. And in the case of a wholesaler, your partner is always going to be the person you partner up with to close the second transaction. It's kind of ambiguous, but here's how I explain it to the people. I'll tell them that, and this goes back to when I really didn't know what I was going to do with the property, whether I was going to keep it or wholesale it, or I was going to rehab it or keep it for a rental. So I would say to them, I'm not sure what I'll do with this property. I'm sure it doesn't make any difference to you whether I'm the one rehabs it or someone else rehabs it. But because I always have, someone bring the money to the table for the closing, this clause is in here subject to partner approval. And I just explain it that way.
Mm-hmm.
This is my money person, and they've never not agreed to a deal that that I've brought them for but there's always that chance they would go, nope, not doing that deal. So I've never had anybody balk at that ever.
Right. I haven't ever had anybody balk at a clause either. Now, what kind of, I think some people stumble over the exact wording because they hear, and that's what's commonly referred to as an escape clause
Mm-hmm.
in the contract. They know what it should roughly say, but people struggle with exactly what it should say. And you just gave one example for the partner approval. And so it typically starts with this contract is subject to X. And
Mm-hmm.
so for an inspection, what would you say would be a good escape clause for the inspection?
I just say it's subject to satisfactory inspection. Now, people will go, shouldn't I put a termite inspection? Shouldn't I put this inspection? And my answer is no, just put subject to inspection.
And you're not referring to like an actual inspection from a property inspector,
No,
right?
it
Right.
it could be an inspection. Maybe I'm going to have my contractor come over and look at the furnace or
Right.
look at the foundation. And if they ask about that, I just say, this is just says subject to inspection because every house is different.
Hmm.
And what I might have looked at on your home might be totally different than on the next house. So, no, I do not get specific. The only time I might get specific and say subject to inspection, and I might go one step further if there is an obvious foundation issue and I'm going to get somebody out there to look at the structure, which is going to be a costly repair and would likely result in a much lower offer, then I put that in there. Because if you've got to add 10 or 15 piers to a house, that's a big deal. It's a lot of money in my area. So that might be the only case, but I think if you put a nice, clear, generalized clause in there, and you should have something, then I think that's sufficient. But now on the other side, my rehabber friends that that buy my houses, they do their inspections before. They look at the house, decide, and unless it is something big like a structural issue, they generally buy with no contingencies.
Right. So yeah, because you want them to make a decision before because you don't
Right
want them
then.
backing out afterwards. And before we continue on that side of it, on the buy side, so you have an inspection clause as a possible one, subject to
Hmm.
partner approval is a second possible one. I tend to like to put subject to funding approval
Hmm. That,
because a lot of times, yeah, I mean it's the same thing like the partner. Like you don't have to specify exactly who is doing funding, but it's a nice honest thing because really it always boils down to whether you're going to get funding or not.
hmm hmm Yeah, that's another one that you could use, and I don't think there's any right way or wrong way to do it. But I think for your protection, when you are the buyer, you want that escape clause just in case of whatever comes up that you don't know about. But in my area, and I'm sure when people work with you, it's the same way. My end buyers, and this is the other thing. People think you need 100 people on your buyers list. You don't. You need a handful of good, solid buyers. And I go back to my same buyers every single time. And 99 times out of 100, they're going to call me from the house because I know what they're looking for. And I know my numbers. We may not be exact, but we're really close.
Hmm.
They'll call me from the house and they'll just say, "Yeah, I'll take it. Send me a contract later." We've done business long enough that we do that. Now, with that being said, I always get an earnest money deposit. Always.
Is that non-refundable?
Non-refundable.
And what
It
what amount is that typically? Does it depend on the deal, or do you have a number set every
um
time?
well, I have with people I've worked with, and I've explained to them over the years, it's just business. It's the way I run my business straight down the line. I get $1,000 if so long as it's a buyer I've worked with and I know them. If it's a brand new buyer, I'm going to ask for proof of funds. If they tell me they have cash or a homeowner's, an equity line or an investor-friendly bank, I don't really care where they get their cash. I just want to know that they have it. Now, when they're new to me, I will ask for a proof of funds letter and I will ask for a larger earnest money deposit, probably around $2,000. And if they are unwilling to do that, then they're not really a buyer.
Right. And the big reason is you don't want to come to closing and find out that they're not coming, and then
Uh-huh.
you're the one that has to tell the seller, "Hey, can't buy your house right now because
Yeah.
your buyer didn't close." So,
Yeah.
right,
And I don't ever try to explain wholesaling that procedure to a seller. I just don't go there.
right, and that's so newer investors when they're trying to sell either sign a contract or do a double closing and selling to an end buyer investor, they struggle with asking for a big amount of non-refundable earnest money, especially if they feel like they're going to make quite a bit on the deal. They don't want to lose the buyer, and so they get scared and let the end buyer control the deal, and you never ever want to do that.
Mm. Nope, never, never. You cannot. And if they start to give you a hard way to over the deposit, say, look, this is just my business model. I do this across the board. It's nothing for you or against you, but this is my policy. And then you just stand firm. You just stand there and be quiet and say, well, I'm sorry. When they say, well, I only want to give you $250, you have to say, then you're not a serious buyer. I'm going to have to move on
Right.
to a serious buyer.
Right, and you hit the nail on the head too with the that's exactly what you do. This is my policy, and then you just be quiet.
You be quiet. Yes.
Yeah,
And
negotiating, that's sometimes for people, especially newer people, being quiet is the hardest part. But man, oh, it works so well. Because if you keep
mhm.
talking, then they know you're not really, committed to it.
Exactly. And that is something that should be non-negotiable in your business. Now, I've been doing this a long time, and I've got a couple of people that we work on a little bit looser terms, but I know with 100% certainty that after doing many, many, many deals with them, if they're out of town, let's say I had a case where my buyer was out of town. He was on vacation, but he knew the area. He was able to pull up the house. The house had been listed previously, so he was able to pull up the interior pictures. I sent him the figures. He said, I'm not going to be back for 2 weeks. I don't have my company checkbook. I said, fine. We didn't have a problem, but I wouldn't have done that if we didn't have a history.
Right, right. So that gets into, you've already mentioned and you kind of already answered one of the questions that I wanted to ask as far as, whether you believe in a small, highly qualified buyers list or a large buyers list.
Yeah, small. The same probably 5 people buy all my deals, and I have people call me all the time and want to get on my list, and I I hope I can send some deals to them eventually. But when you get buyers that are what I call like you, they're real investors, and you know what they want, and you get a house in their area, and when you can call them, the day you've got the house under contract, I always get a lockbox on the house, and they just go over there and look at it, and we're usually closing in no more than 10 days. It just is so easy once you've got this really small but very responsive buyers list. Why would you mess that up? They've
Right,
kind of they've earned their place on your A list, in other words.
right, absolutely. And then you're just focused on finding more great deals instead of wasting your time trying to find a buyer and then worrying about whether they're actually going to be able to close or not.
Right.
Yeah, and I do exactly what you do. I have a small group of people that I call. Typically, I don't have to call more than one.
Hmm.
At most, it's usually just the second person. If the first one didn't want it, we'll take down the deal. And what that keeps me from having to deal with is if you're having to send out to a bunch of people on a buyer's list that you don't know much about, you're going to get calls with people asking you, well, how old is the roof? And
Hmm.
really, you don't want to be taking those calls because that person is not serious enough to be able to buy the house. On one off or two occasions, maybe they would end up being able to buy it, but you're going to do a lot of hand holding, and that's going to take time away from you getting other deals to do. So, uh, finding out who the qualified buyers are and having that small group of people that you send the deal to is such a time saver. Can you explain how you found your highly qualified buyers and how you built the relationship with them?
Hmm. I can tell you exactly where I found them in my RIA group. Um, Several of the buyers are long-term buyers. One gentleman is probably 76 or 77 and still works us under the tables. He's got a couple hundred houses and he's one of the guys you can call. He's got a very strict criteria though because he's holding everything, so he's got this very niche down. I want to be in this price range. So I can call him and he'll go look, yeah, I'll buy it, when we're going to close, and he writes a check. He's someone I met through my RIA. Look at your long-term investors that are still buying. Another several folks that I sell houses to, they actually they're very active investors. They're in my RIA group and they have full-time professional jobs, but they have built systems for their rehabbing business, and they go on their lunch. If you call them, they leave and go on their lunch and look at the house typically, or no longer than at the end of the day. So they get their cash from small investor-friendly banks because they have great jobs. There's another gal in there that she's a full-time investor. She's set up with a local bank that's a investor-friendly bank. But I've met and found all of them through my RIA group. Now, I did find a buyer one time on Bigger Pockets. I had a house that was a little bit of an outlier, but still a good house, and I posted it on Bigger Pockets and sold that guy a couple of houses till he moved over into commercial. But if you've got a decent RIA, you'll find them there.
Right, and what's your thoughts on building? So there's always the question with wholesaling, right? So if you there's two options to build a buyer's list. Should you start building buyer's list before you find deals, or should you find deals and use that as a way to build your buyer's list?
I think you should know who your buyers, who the real people are in your that you want on your buyer's list, because you can take them houses, and if it's not in the area they want or the type of house they want, they're going to think you're an idiot after a while. So I think you need to start building the buyer's list first and just be upfront with them. So I'm going to be wholesaling. I'm looking for some people to put on my buyer's list, but I want to be sure I'm looking for the types of houses that you are interested in. So could you answer a couple of questions for me? And they'll usually say, I'm looking for, one gal, she said, I'm looking for 3-bedroom brick ranches. I hate basements. I hate garages because they always leave all their junk there and I have to clean it out. Because I'll call her up and she'll go, does it have a basement? Yes. Well, I don't know. I'll go look at it. But, and they have certain areas and they want to attract certain tenants. Therefore, they're looking for a certain price, a house in a certain price range. And for one fellow on my buyer's list, he's looking strictly up to about $60,000. He doesn't care if it has knotty pine cabinets in it. That's great because they're indestructible. He isn't going to replace them. So that's another case, that's another whole conversation. But he'll sometimes buy deals that maybe the numbers are kind of tight for a full rehab, but he isn't going to rehab it. He's not going to replace the cabinets and those sorts of things. So it's still a great deal for him.
Right. That's something I want to get into a little bit further in our conversation too, as far as some people knock wholesaling and say that it's really not a good way for people to get started for different reasons. And so I want to come back to that. The fact that you just said that, he buys what other typical rehabbers don't buy. And so we'll go back to that and why that's important. But I'm kind of just saying that so I remember too. But I wanted to ask. So one of the worries that wholesalers have is if they put a house under contract and then can't find a buyer, what do they do?
Yeah, and that was my terrifying thought, all those years that I didn't wholesale, because it is hard to wrap your brain around it. But it all comes down to, and people say this, but it is the truth. If you have a great deal in a decent area, someone will buy it. What I find people do is they do what I call eraser math. They know the 70% formula or wherever their starting point is, and then the numbers don't quite work. So they start erasing, well, maybe the repairs won't be quite this much. And here's one comp over here that's outside of the norm. So let's just take that comp. And before they know it, they've put together a deal that's not really a deal. So that's where I think the problem lies. If you stick to your numbers in the beginning, you're sure that you've got the getting it at the right price, then you will be able to sell it, but you still need a place to sell it. Like in my case, we have a great RIA group, but maybe you can connect with other wholesalers out there putting up "We Buy Houses" sign, or rehabbers. People, call some of those people. Some of them will probably say, you're crazy for calling me, but then maybe you'll find one guy who is a rehabber who's always looking for more deals. So that's another way you can find buyers. I have bought houses and put out bandit signs in the area, want to buy a house cheap. So I think sometimes you have to get creative. Another thing that I've done is to pull up that street. If it's in a rental neighborhood, and I bought a house once that wasn't in a neighborhood that I knew my regular buyers list was not going to want it, but it was a great deal. It was on a street called Lincoln, and all I did was go into the tax assessor site and pull up, just typed in Lincoln Avenue, and when I started looking down the pages, Danny, there were at least 25 investors that owned property on those 4 or 5 blocks. And then I just sent them all a letter. I just sent them all a letter and said, hey, I have a property in the 1100 block of Lincoln. Would you be interested in talking about it? And I had a buyer within a day or two.
Wow. I'm taking notes.
Oh, now see, and that won't work in your not really nice residential areas, but in a
Right.
rental area, these were $60,000 houses in an area that was a high percentage rental area. But try that sometime if you know it's a rental area. You just put it in there, and I would see the same names coming up multiple times. The ones that didn't know to buy in a trust, then there were trust names, and then there were ABG Real Estate Company had like 10 properties.
Right.
So it was an awesome way to find a cash buyer quick.
Yeah, and also you could see if there's a loan on that property that they
Right.
got, and it's likely, if it's not like a bank or something, you could find lenders that way as well.
Right. You can find people, and sometimes people they concentrate on areas, and if they are cash buyers, you've got hit the nail on the head. They are also lenders many times, and you can
Hmm.
find those people if you have a back in your good RIA too. Remember the cash buyer that I was talking about, who just actually came to closing with this little checkbook and wrote a check. He was also a lender. Now that's all cooled off a lot since Dodd-Frank. He used to buy houses, rent them out, and then would convert them to, tenant buyers. Um, he still makes loans to other investors from time to time. So investor wasn't affected by Dodd-Frank.
Right. Yeah, so it's almost like always, taking a tough situation. You couldn't find a buyer immediately, so you're forced to these other things, but these other things also put you in a position to where you can find lenders and other things like that. So it's actually a
Hmm.
positive. You turn the negative into a positive. But I wanted to go even further, though. Let's say that you got one under contract, you did the eraser math, you kept changing the calculation until it worked for you so you could put the deal under contract. And then you couldn't find a buyer. You pounded the pavement, you went and put out bandit signs, went to the RIA group, looked for landlords on the street, couldn't find anybody interested in it. What do you do at that point?
Well, you can do one of two things really. You can go back to the seller and say, the repairs are going to cost a lot more than I anticipated. So then, I need to talk to you about renegotiating the price. Sometimes they will do that, sometimes they won't. Worst case scenario, you've written your contract so that you can get out of the contract. Now, I will say this, you don't want to be going around doing that too often because you will get a reputation in your area. Um,
Absolutely right.
but sometimes sellers, if they're reasonable people, and you just go in there and you just say, "Look, I messed up the numbers. I did not realize how much this was going to cost, all of this." If sometimes they're reasonable enough that they will negotiate down a little bit, even enough for you to sell the house and go through with the deal, even if you're not going to make a lot off the house. And that's one point I want to put out there. You should always try to close with your seller, even if it means you're not going to really make anything. You just don't want to be the person that seller tells 10 people,
Right.
"Well, I
You've
met
got
this lady, and guess what?"
mm-hmm. Yeah, and you might think that that wouldn't happen, but it absolutely does.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean, you've got to always follow through with what you do, and I think that's what makes a lot of people nervous. But if you and that, but you should take that point, and it makes you nervous, and use that as a reason to never do that eraser math.
Don't do eraser math. And God knows we've all done it, and that's
Yeah.
especially in the beginning, it's tempting.
Yeah, and I've got to share a story too. It's actually it's funny now, but at the time it wasn't. So I put a house under contract and thought it was a really good deal. And that afternoon, I think I was looking at my numbers again after I put it under contract, and I was looking at my notes, and it said 3 bedroom, 1 bath. But in my head, for some reason, I started walking through the house again because I had just walked through it that day. So I was thinking back through walking through the house, and I said, "Oh my gosh, there's not 3 bedrooms in that house. There were only two." And so all of my calculations I had done before I went over there about value were based on a 3 bedroom. So I just, all of a sudden got really nervous
Hmm.
and started calculating, okay, well, what are the comps for the 2 bedroom? And, I did exactly what you said. I just owned up to it. I called them and said, look, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. And even if they didn't want to negotiate, I would still buy it at what I told them I would because I keep my word. But they did. They allowed me to have the price lowered just a little bit,
Hmm.
and it worked out great. So don't ever feel like they would never budge because people, as long as you're honest with them, don't go in
Hmm.
there and lie about things and everything. Just be honest.
Yeah, and there's no, I mean, that's a big mea culpa when you say, look, I messed up. But if you say it just like that and you tell them the truth, they're going to be so much more willing to work with you. They may not, like you said, may not come all the way down to where the price should have been, but if they budge, you're still in a much better position.
Right, right. And another thing I wanted to ask you, so we've talked pretty much about, putting a house under contract, having an escape clause, how to find a good small list of qualified investor buyers that you can sell your deals to, what happens if you don't find a buyer. And I want to bring up something that not a lot of people talk about when it comes to real estate investing in general, and but more specifically wholesaling. Um, in certain areas of town, I'm sure you probably have the same situation. We have, certain areas that aren't really good retail areas, right? So these are rental mainly. You can't find many comps because people aren't really selling the houses.
Hmm.
It's either owner financed or rental properties. And people try to buy those with the same formulas using the 70% minus repairs, and it doesn't work.
No.
Because first of all, you don't have comps to go on. Second of all, that's not the model for that type of property. Um, how do you handle those types of properties when it comes to figuring out what you can offer and then what you can sell them for?
Well, I think the neighborhood definitely comes into play, and the worse the neighborhood for me, the lower the percentage. If it's that type of a neighborhood, I'm probably rarely going to go over 60%, and sometimes I've gone lower than that. I think you have to it because it is tough to find comps for those types of houses. In that case, I would rather lose the deal than to really make a big mistake on value. But I will in general, I'll start down if it's that type of a neighborhood. I'll start at 60%, start taking out the repairs. If I'm, for a wholesaler, you need to take out your fee. And here's a point too. If you're in those types of neighborhoods, you may be making less than what you would normally make. If your normal fee is $10,000 and you can only make five off of a house like that, that's still a good day at the end of the day. So I think you sometimes have to adjust your expectations, but you're going to have to buy it cheaper than what you would normally buy it to be safe.
Yeah, always got to be safe. Now, what do you have certain buyers though that buy in those areas that have different criteria they go on?
The only people that I have, yeah, that well, if they're rehabbers, most of my rehabbers, I've got, I would say they're up a notch or two. They no longer buy in those marginal
Hmm.
rental neighborhoods, but I do have a couple of landlords that still, I mentioned that they're looking in that 30 to $60,000, which is a kind of a lower blue collar neighborhood, I would say. Um, They will buy the houses and you can use the lower formula. You can generally still make your fee because I do the same thing on every house. I go through and I figure a complete rehab. Well, those landlords are, and that by that time it's a really low number. So I go back. I have a second column on my sheet, and I'll start saying, what if it were a landlord, what would they do? So if they have a furnace that's, let's say, a furnace and it's 12 years old, what is the life of a gas forced air furnace? Is what, about 20 years if it's been maintained. So if the furnace is 12, 13 years old, where a rehabber might pull it out and say, it's just going to cause my buyer questions, that landlord is going to leave that furnace so long as it looks okay. I had the house with everything knotty pine. A rehabber would have yanked all of that stuff out. This guy was, you would have thought you'd given him some gold because, I mean, you could hit those cabinets with a baseball bat and nothing was going to happen. It even had some knotty pine walls in there. That man was happy as a lark.
Yeah.
Um, the standard was different. He wasn't going to do a thing in that kitchen. The countertop was like a greenish, ugly, the kind with the metal strip around, really
Oh,
old.
yeah, yeah.
But it was pristine. There wasn't anything wrong with it. He wasn't going to change any of that. So I knew by the time I took out all the things he was not going to fix or update, what my offer would have to be to give him still a great deal. And
Yeah,
that's where I
absolutely.
made my offer. So
Right.
it is different if you have a couple of those kind of landlords on your buyers list, and you should for deals that you can't do anything else with, um, then you call them.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, so always in your building of your buyers list, get highly qualified buyers, but also make sure that you get a diversity of people looking for different things, because no one investor wants every different type of property,
No.
unless they're going to be doing wholesaling themselves as well. But the yeah, finding the people that have the different criteria, and the example for me and where I am is I've got friends that actually buy, and they base it all on if it's a two bedroom house that's under X square feet, then it's 30,000 minus repairs is what they want to buy it for. If
Mm-hmm.
it's a three bedroom, it's 40,000 minus repairs, and it's as simple as that. It doesn't have to get any more complicated. So it makes it real easy if I look at one of those houses that there's not a lot of comps for. It's more of a rental area. That's all I have to do to determine value. I don't have to look up any comps.
Oh, so run that by me again. Now that's something I might have to write down. So they're looking at the property, and if it's two bedroom, they're saying I'm going to offer 30,000 less
Well,
than
they want to
repair.
buy it for that much.
They want to
So
buy
if
it for
right, they want to
30,000
buy
less
it 30
repairs.
minus repairs. So if the house needs 5,000 to make it rentable,
Uh-huh.
they're going to be willing for the two bedroom one bath, willing to pay 25,000.
Interesting.
Right. So if
Interesting.
I offered 30, I could get 5,000 on it.
Interesting. Yeah, that is a way. And here there were a certain group of landlords, and they all lived in really nice houses, but they were investing in what I call the really low end housing. They used to call them disposable houses here because they were really in not great houses, but they'd buy them for $5,000. Maybe it was a three bedroom house and the Section 8 rent was five something. They'd have that house paid off in 10 months and then it would just cash flow and they would piecemeal it together. They
Hmm.
back before 2008, they had some of them had 75 of those. The cash flow was
Oh, wow.
huge. But did I want to be in that arena? No, I don't, because they were having people go down there and collect the rent before they went to the bar on Friday night, right after they got paid.
Oh, right.
It
Yeah.
just, it wasn't my thing, but they made a lot of money doing that. I know that.
Yeah. Where there's more work involved, there's more money to be made, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're willing to do that kind of work, and I'm not. I'd
Me
rather
neither.
make less but have less hassle.
Me neither.
Um, so this gets you mentioned again the gentleman that was real interested in the knotty pine because it was indestructible, and how people have different buying criteria, like we just talked about, and that's where I wanted to tie back in here is some people, usually people selling other methods of investing, but some people do like to say that wholesaling is much more difficult than rehabbing because you have to get that property at a lower cost than your end buyer, and they're suggesting that you're basically competing with the end buyers. So you're having to get it even lower, so you're going to get less deals. Combine that with having to do more deals because you don't make as much per deal, um, which makes wholesaling a bad choice based on what they're talking about right there. Where you
Mm-hmm.
have to do more deals and it's harder to get the deal because you're offering less than what other people would. And can you explain why they're wrong about that?
Well, some people simply aren't marketers. Now you are a rehabber and you're a savvy marketer. But I'm after being in this business for many years, what I have found is most people that are rehabbers, they want to rehab. They don't want to do direct mail and they don't want to do any of that stuff. They just want to have a deal show up that's, if I can give them a deal, because a wholesaler typically has to buy it below wholesale to get, which does mean that if I'm competing with Danny and he's only looking to make money from the rehab, then he's not going to have to figure in my $10,000 wholesale fee or 5,000 or whatever it is. So that is true. But what I have found is that there isn't a single buyer on my list that's doing any marketing other than one gal. She looks on the MLS and occasionally finds a rental on there. Um, most of the fellows that have the full-time jobs, they also, they look at on the MLS a little bit, but mainly they just are there to have wholesalers bring them deals. They don't have an interest in marketing. And when the older gentleman, where he's concerned, he goes to the commissioner's sale, that's what he thinks marketing is. If it is at the commissioner's sale and he can buy it, then he's done some type of marketing in his mind or found the deal. Other than that, he just sits around and waits for people to bring him deals, which they do.
All right, that's an awesome point to make. Um, a lot of times you're not dealing with uh, people that are doing a lot of marketing, and even the competition you do have on the deals might not be as sophisticated and might not be able to come up with accurate numbers. But then there's the other side also with the way I like to look at it as well is that you find the atypical buyers as well, so that they have the different criteria. And so if you're thinking in terms of only buying rehabs and not doing wholesaling, then you're going to pass up on deals that don't make sense as a rehab.
Right. Well, here's the other thing where a marketer is of great value, or say a wholesaler is of great value to a rehabber, and that is that a lot of us we market to off-market deals. We're marketing where I mentioned my friend, she's looking on the MLS. Another friend is down at the commissioner's sale. But there's this whole vast arena out there of off-market deals with absentee owners and probates. They're not doing any of those. So if you are a wholesaler that gets very good at marketing, and make no mistake, your number one job as a wholesaler is marketing. That's it, to get deals in. So once you learn how to market for deals and in ways that other people that are doing other things either don't want to do or don't want to learn it, whatever the case may be, it doesn't really matter, then you have deals that they don't have access to, and it makes you very popular.
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, so I mean, I don't think that those arguments are usually valid from the people that try to say that wholesaling is not a good
No.
way to go. I think it's always something that people should focus on and learn because, like you said, becoming an expert marketer is really what it's all about. No matter which part of real estate investing you end up wanting and finding to be
Well,
your path.
yeah, and let's face it, Danny, not everybody is has the skills or the knowledge to be a rehabber like you do. And in many cases, they just plain don't want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
It's they generally speaking, people don't have the knowledge or the talent or maybe the resources to get the money, whatever they don't know how to do that. So for some people, it's wholesaling is just a better fit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned at the beginning that you also do some coaching, and I
Hmm.
like to ask people that do coaching for investors if you've ever noticed like a common trait or something that people that do well in the business have that they possess that maybe the people that don't do well are lacking. Is there something that you've noticed that's common?
It comes down to one thing. They take, well, really two things. They have a plan and they take action. I think there are people that I have come to my RIA group for now almost 20 years. They come every time and they've never bought a deal because they learn and learn and learn and study, but they never actually buy a deal. You're you're so much better off to just take action. At some point in time, you've got to just cut to the chase and go buy a house. And you might muck it up. You know, you might not make as much money as you had hoped, but it will be I like to call your first house as college, where you go and you really you learn on the job. But yeah, it boils down to the people are divided, those that do take action and those that don't. And I think even if you're taking the wrong action and maybe not doing it just right, if you're taking action and putting one foot in front of the other, that's it. You got to get up each day and put one foot in front of the other, but you need a plan. You really need a plan for what you're going to do.
Yeah, absolutely. That's good advice. And is there a book that you've enjoyed that you've read recently that you would could share with us?
There is. I read several good books last year. My new favorite book, and that'll change if you ask me probably in a couple months. My new favorite book is called The 12-Week Year by Brian Moran. And this goes back to what I just talked about, which is taking action. What I love about this book is, we all set annual goals, and I think the statistics say most people have thrown them out the window by January. But what is different about this book is that it tells you to break your year down into 12-week segments. So you look at your grand plan, and maybe your plan is you've been working on all of your things. You've been working on your website and, your RIA Mobile and all of that. So maybe for this 12-week segment, that would be your focus. Maybe in your next 12-week segment to reach your grand plan, it'll be these three things. But I think it takes all the pressure off of you looking down the road 12 months, and it helps you to get very focused on what you need to do now. So I love that book.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Isn't Brian Moran, doesn't he do the Facebook marketing? Do you
He
know?
does a lot of different things. He does a
Oh,
lot of
okay.
different things, yes. And
Yeah,
I
the name
think
sounds
he
familiar.
initially made his money in what was it, gyms or fitness or something like that. But he is a brilliant marketer. He's a brilliant guy, period. And I love that book because it's applicable to any investing strategy, to any business.
Yeah, great. And so is there a way that the listeners out there for the Flipping Junkie podcast can find you?
The best way to find me is over on my blog, the Louisville Gals Real Estate blog, and they can contact me through there, and then we can get on a more of an email course of correspondence. But that's probably the best way. If I try to give you the spelling of my name, they'll just they'll get that wrong. So Louisville Gals Real Estate blog.
Okay. And I always create show notes as well for these interviews. And so you can find the show notes where we're going to include links to the book mentioned and to Sharon's website there. And you can find that at flippingJunkie.com/podcast/Sharon Vornholt. And Sharon is Sharon, and then Vornholt is Vornholt. That's right,
Got
right?
it.
All right.
Yes, you do. You got it. You
All
got
right.
it.
So that's it. It's recorded. If you want to catch it again, you can play it back. But she's also been kind enough to provide us with a detailed guide. It's pretty awesome. It's about marketing to probates and absentee owners for awesome deals. And it shows you why those methods of marketing work so well by delving into the point of view of the seller for each situation, for the probates and for absentee owners. So I highly recommend you download that guide, and that'll be on the show notes page. And it's absolutely free. It's not anything that costs anything. So definitely download it, check it out, and visit that page. It's called Probates and Absentee Owners, your fast track to real estate riches guide. It's really great. So check that out on the show notes page. All right, Sharon. Well, I really enjoyed the interview and got a lot out of it, and appreciate you taking the time to join me on the show.
Well, it's always fun, Danny, and thanks so much for having me.
All right, thanks, Sharon. I'll talk to you soon. Thanks for listening to the show. I'm glad you joined us for this episode. And to find out more and learn more about how to flip houses, go to FlippingJunkie.com. And to go to the show notes page, you can go to FlippingJunkie.com/podcast/Sharon Vornholt, or you can simply just go to FlippingJunkie.com/7, the number 7, FlippingJunkie.com/7 to download the guide that she was kind enough to share with us. You can download that for free at FlippingJunkie.com/7. Great episodes coming up in the coming weeks. I release a new podcast episode every week, so be sure to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher, and we'll see you next week.